long and turbulent story of Ireland's fight for independence should have ended in triumph. For centuries, the dream of a free state was the one cause that united everyone. But when victory over the British Empire finally came, what happened next was shocking. Instead of peace, Ireland went to war with itself. Brother turned against brother. Comrades who had stood shoulder to shoulder in the War of Independence now hunted each other with a ferocity that would leave a permanent scar on the nation's soul. The Irish Civil War was a tragedy born from a bitter fight over the very meaning of freedom. And nowhere was this tragedy more brutal, personal, or horrific than in County Kerry. In the winter of 1923, the conflict had turned the green hills of Kerry into a landscape of profound and bitter hatred. Then, in the early hours of March 7th, one of the most savage acts of the entire war was set in motion. 9 prisoners of war weren't just going to be executed, they were going to be used as props in a gruesome public spectacle. They were tied together in a circle, bound to a landmine, planted by their own countrymen, and deliberately blown to pieces. This is the tragic story of the Ballyseedy Massacre, the official lies that tried to bury the truth, and the one man who was blown clear of the blast, surviving the impossible to make sure the truth didn't die with the dead. To understand how former comrades could commit such an atrocity, we have to go back to the moment the victory soured. The Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed in December 1921, ending the brutal War of Independence. It was a huge achievement, granting Ireland a level of freedom that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. But it wasn't the fully independent republic that so many had fought and died for. The treaty established the Irish Free State as a dominion within the British Empire and required its leaders to swear an oath of fidelity to the British monarch. For one side, led by Michael Collins, the treaty was a strategic stepping stone, the freedom to achieve freedom, as he famously put it. It was a pragmatic compromise that offered a path to build a stable, self-governing Ireland. They formed the new National Army to establish the authority of the fledgling Free State. For the other side, the anti-treaty IRA, the treaty was a profound betrayal. For them, that oath to the Crown was an unforgivable concession. They had fought for a republic, and anything less felt like a surrender of their core principles. These men, often called Republicans or irregulars, saw the Free State government as traitors to the cause. puppets of the very empire they had just fought to expel. And just like that, the seeds of division were sown. Ireland's Parliament, the Dáil, ratified the treaty by a narrow margin, but the split was irreparable. By June of 1922, political disagreement had exploded into open warfare. The conflict was especially heartbreaking because it was so personal. Friends, neighbours, and even family members found themselves on opposite sides. It was a war without clear front lines, fought in the same streets and fields where these men once planned ambushes against the British together. That shared experience was replaced by a new, more poisonous intimacy: the knowledge of your enemy's tactics, their safe houses, and their families. This toxic familiarity fueled a cycle of violence that grew increasingly vicious, especially in County Kerry, a staunchly Republican region where the guerrilla war dragged on. By early 1923, Kerry had become the crucible of the Civil War's final, most savage phase. The situation in Kerry was a powder keg. The spark that lit the fuse came on March 6, 1923, in the quiet area of Knocknagoshel. For weeks, the anti-treaty IRA had been perfecting the use of booby-trapped mines against National Army patrols. That night, they executed a cunning and deadly plan. A false tip was fed to the Free State garrison in Castle Island about a supposed Republican arms dump hidden in the woods. A party of National Army soldiers was sent to investigate. As the soldiers began moving stones to uncover the cache, they triggered a massive concealed mine. The explosion was catastrophic. 5 soldiers were killed instantly, their bodies mutilated by the blast. A 6th man was so badly wounded that both of his legs had to be amputated. The Knocknagoshel ambush was the single deadliest attack on the National Army in over 6 months, a shocking blow to morale and a personal tragedy for its command. Of course, the news ripped through the Free State forces in Kerry with volcanic fury. The man in charge of the Kerry command was Major General Paddy O'Daly, a veteran of the 1916 Easter Rising and a former leader of Michael Collins's elite assassination unit, the Squad. O'Daly was a hardened commander sent to Kerry to crush resistance by any means necessary. He had famously said, "Nobody had asked me to take kid gloves to Kerry, so I didn't." 2 of the officers killed at Knocknagoshel were his close personal friends. For O'Daly, this wasn't just a military loss, it was now a personal vendetta. The rage for reprisal was immediate. Within hours, O'Daly issued a chilling new directive. He wrote to the officers that the tragedy of Knocknagoshel must not be repeated. From now on, he ordered, any barricades or suspected roadside bombs were to be cleared by Republican prisoners. He framed it as a necessary measure to protect his men, insisting that the taking out of prisoners is not to be regarded as a reprisal, but as the only alternative left us. But this was a thin veil for a raw thirst for vengeance. The order was, in reality, a death sentence, a license for his troops to carry out extrajudicial killings under the guise of procedure. The stage was now set for one of the most premeditated atrocities in modern Irish history. In the dark, early hours of March 7th, just after the Knocknagoshel explosion, the retribution began. At Ballymullen Barracks in Tralee, Republican prisoners were dragged from their cells. Many were brutally interrogated and beaten. Colonel David Nelligan, another senior officer, then selected 9 men: Patrick Buckley, John Daly, Patrick Hartnett, Michael O'Connell, John O'Connor, George O'Shea, Tim Toomey, James Walsh, and Stephen Fuller. They were from all over the region, some from the same small parish, now bound together by a horrifying fate. They were told they were being taken to clear a barricade on the road, a plausible lie, given O'Daly's new order. As the men were loaded onto a truck, one of their guards offered them cigarettes, saying with chilling finality, "That's the last cigarette you'll ever smoke." The prisoners were driven to Ballyseedy Cross, a quiet crossroads a few miles outside Tralee. There, waiting for them, was not a Republican roadblock, but one built by the soldiers themselves. At its centre was a powerful landmine, placed there for one murderous purpose. The 9 men were unloaded amidst a torrent of abuse. One soldier reportedly sneered at them, calling them Irish bastards. The prisoners' hands were tied behind their backs. They were then bound together by their arms and legs with rope, forming a tight circle around the mine. The soldiers stood back as a captain informed them of their fate. In a 1980 interview, the lone survivor, Stephen Fuller, recalled the captain's words. He said, "We've got to blow you up with a mine." The captain told him they could say their prayers. Fuller remembered the man next to him saying his prayers and then a simple goodbye. Fuller said goodbye back, and the farewells passed down the line. The soldiers retreated. The fuse was lit, and then the night exploded. The detonation was immense, a horrifying blast of fire and shrapnel that tore the men apart. 8 of them were killed instantly, their bodies obliterated. To make sure the job was done, survivor testimony states the soldiers then opened fire with machine guns and threw grenades into the smoking crater. The scene was one of unimaginable horror. In the days that followed, local people reported seeing birds eating human flesh from the trees at the crossroads. The mangled remains were gathered and callously stuffed into coffins that had been prepared in advance. When the bodies were returned to Tralee, distraught family members demanded to see their loved ones. A riot broke out as they broke open the coffins, only to find a horrific jumble of unidentifiable body parts. One woman, whose son was over 6 feet tall, wailed in anguish, "But my son was 6 feet tall. How can he come home to me in such a small coffin?" One family could only identify their son by the distinct curls of his hair. The massacre wasn't just an execution, it was a calculated act of terror meant to dehumanize its victims and sow fear across the country. This focus on the human cost of war is something we tried to bring to all of our stories. History isn't just about dates and battles, it's about the people who lived through it. If you value this approach, please take a moment to subscribe to Emerald Chronicle and click the bell icon so you don't miss our future documentaries. The soldiers at Ballyseedy had prepared 9 coffins, confident their gruesome task was complete. But they'd made a huge miscalculation. They hadn't counted on a miracle. By what he later called an explosive freak, one man, Stephen Fuller, wasn't blown to pieces. The force of the explosion hurled him high into the air, severing the ropes that bound him to his comrades. He was flung across the road, over a ditch, and into a nearby stream. He lost consciousness when he hit the ground, but the shock of the cold water may have revived him. Dazed, burned, and with his clothes completely blown off, he came to his senses. He was alive, realizing the soldiers would soon be back to inspect their handiwork. He crawled along the riverbed, using the bank for cover. He eventually made it to the home of the Kern family, who took him in and hid him in a dugout on their farm for several weeks, protecting him while the Free State Army scoured the countryside for the one man who could expose their lie. The existence of a survivor was a disaster for the Kerry command. The official story was already calculating that the 9 prisoners had been killed while clearing a Republican mine, victims of their own side's tactics. The Army's Commander-in-Chief, Richard Mulcahy, defended O'Daly and even read the falsified report into the official Dáil record. When they learned Fuller had escaped and was telling the truth, the Army issued a desperate piece of propaganda claiming that Stephen Fuller had become insane. But Fuller was very much sane, and his testimony was a living, breathing refutation of the official narrative. He carried the truth of what happened that night, not as a ghost, but as a witness. His survival meant the cold-blooded nature of the Ballyseedy Massacre could never be completely erased by the state that perpetrated it. The horror of Ballyseedy didn't end at that crossroads. It wasn't an isolated act of rage, but the start of a coordinated campaign of terror across County Kerry, a clear policy of reprisal killings overseen by Paddy O'Daly. The army's method, using prisoners to clear fictitious mines, was repeated. On the very same day, March 7th, 4 more Republican prisoners were taken from Killarney to Countess Bridge and tied to a mine in exactly the same way. All 4 were killed. 5 days later, on March 12th, the atrocity was replicated again at Bahugs near Cahersiveen. 5 prisoners were taken from the workhouse there. But this time, learning from Stephen Fuller's escape, the soldiers took an extra ghastly precaution. Before tying the men to the mine, they shot each of them in the legs to ensure no one could get away. All 5 were blown up. In less than a week, 17 Republican prisoners were murdered in these mine atrocities. Over the course of what became known as the Terror Month in Kerry, at least 32 anti-treaty fighters died, though some estimates are slightly higher. Only 5 of them were killed in actual combat. The long-term impact on these communities was profound. The trauma was deeply personal. Molly O'Shea, the sister of George O'Shea, who was killed at Ballyseedy, suffered a severe mental breakdown after her brother's death and would spend years in psychiatric care. In a poignant act of solidarity, Stephen Fuller later helped lobby for her to receive a state pension. Families weren't just bereaved, they were often ostracized, and a deep-seated mistrust of the new Irish state festered in Kerry for generations. Paddy O'Daly, the architect of the atrocities, was never held accountable. He was defended by Defence Minister Richard Mulcahy and kept his command, though he was eventually dismissed from the army in 1924 over a separate scandal. For the rest of his life, Stephen Fuller carried the weight of being the sole survivor. He entered politics, serving as a Fianna Fáil TD, a member of the Irish Parliament from 1937 to 1943. In a remarkable display of grace, he rarely spoke publicly about the massacre, saying he didn't want the bitterness of the Civil War passed down to the next generation. He even married Mary Ann Toomey, the sister of Timothy Toomey, one of the men who died beside him. It wasn't until 1980, in a landmark BBC documentary, that he gave his full testimony, ensuring his account was preserved for history. Today, a striking bronze monument stands at Ballyseedy Cross. It shows a fallen figure for the prisoners, a mother and child for the suffering and future of Ireland, and a determined youth striding forward. It's a solemn reminder of the human cost of a war that pitted Irishmen against Irishmen. The Ballyseedy Massacre remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Irish state, a brutal testament to how the idealism of a revolution can curdle into the hatred of a civil war. the story of its victims and of the one man who survived to tell the truth, challenges a nation to confront the most painful parts of its past and to remember the full, complex and tragic story of how Ireland won its freedom, only to nearly tear itself apart.
At Emerald Chronicle, we believe history isn't just a record of battles and dates. It's the story of real people, their choices, and their courage in the face of impossible times. If you appreciate this human approach to the past, we'd love for you to join us. Subscribe to the channel, tap the bell icon, and be part of our journey as we continue uncovering Ireland's most powerful and untold stories. Thank you for watching.